Well, if you would indulge me a few moments to talk about the passing of what I feel is one of the great broadcasters of our times. His name was Ron Gregory, and Ron, formerly of WOWO, has passed away. Now, I've known Ron for, a number of years because I got to meet Ron clear back in the 1990s. Ron came to WOWO, I believe, in the 1970s, and he became part of the famous group of WOWO broadcasters, starting with Bob Seavers, did the morning. Chris Roberts, tremendous voice. Chris, and then you had Ron Gregory. Yes, there were other famous ones on WOWO, but that was the three amigos that I remember of the great ones. Well, I happened to come across Ron because I ended up working for WOWO starting back in 1992. I had previously worked at a station, WGL, which was across town from WOWO, and I was a talk show host there for one day a week. I happened to run across a gentleman by the name of Gary No. Well, Gary No back then was the program director at WOWO, and we were standing there chatting. And Gary, out of the blue, said, "Hey, how would you like to work for a real radio station?" Now, when you get the program director of WOWO saying, "Hey, how do you work for a real station?" I was stunned. So we got to chatting, and ultimately, I ended up going to work for WOWO. I was a part-timer, but this is a weird part. Back in the 1990s, WOWO was still a music station. Now, keep in mind, they were AM station, and FM was big. FM was coming up, and the FM stations were starting to kick WOWO's behind, let's be honest. People were getting FM radios. They were buying them from stores, getting them in their cars, whatever. They liked FM because thunderstorms didn't mess them up. And they were in stereo. You like the music. So WOWO was trying to figure out, what do we do? How do we survive? So Gary said to me, here's what we're going to do. We're going to put you on at 6 to 7 p.m. every night, Monday through Friday, and you're going to do a talk show. I'm going, whoa, okay. Well, the person who was on the air afternoon drive at that time was Ron Gregory. That's right. Ron Gregory was doing the afternoon. So I would go into his studio, which is the main studio at WOWO, had all the windows looking out over the city. And you could see into the newsroom, and then there was a fire escape. They really had a fire escape, folks. They did. Well, anyway, go in there, and I talked to Ron. We would talk for a while. And the guy was just brilliant. He was smart. He had a great sense of humor. And he was just fun to be around. So I would come on after it for 6 to 7 p.m. And they brought in an intern or whatever she was. It was a lady who was working at WOWO, young lady. And she was my producer. She would answer all the phones that would ring. And she had a little computer thing. And there was a little monitor in my studio because I was in a studio across the hallway. It was a very nice studio, but it had no windows or anything. But that's where I did my show from. But I couldn't see her, and she would just put these messages on the screen that I could look at and see who was on what line. She would also make these snarky comments to me. I didn't know who she was, like I said. Back then, I didn't know who to, but later on, she became a very influential part of my life because she became my producer. When I was doing WOWO full-time, the Queen, Diane. That was her back then. That's how we got to know each other. But we didn't know each other back then. Later, we did. Well, anyway, so I was doing 6 to 7, and that's how I got to know Ron. Well, ultimately, that came to be that the man who owned WOWO, he's a New York City guy, big money, whatever, sold the station to a company called the Sutton family. The Sutton family in New York owns a radio station called WLIB. It was a daytime station on 1190 AM. Same as WOWO. See, they had to turn their station off at night because WOWO owned the East Coast. We did. So he sold the station to him. And they sent a representative over to WOWO. We all met in the general manager's office, learning that they were going to cut WOWO down, going to cut the wattage down, maybe get rid of us, maybe end the station. We didn't know. Well, ultimately, a gentleman up in South Bend, or Elkhart, Indiana, Federated Media, he bought WOWO. And when he did, we ended up becoming part of his chain of radio stations in Fort Wayne that already consisted of WMEE, WMEF, WLYV. It was Federated Media. They were located on Maples Road on the south side of town. So ultimately, we left downtown Fort Wayne, the fourth floor, and we ended up going down to the south side of Fort Wayne. And there, well, that's where I continued to do weekends. Saturday afternoon, 1 to 4, 1 to 5, whatever. I just did weekends. But in 1994, when the O.J. Simpson trial happened, I started to watch that presentation on TV. And every day in the afternoon, I would go on to Ron Gregory's show because he was doing afternoons on WOWO. I'd go into a show and discuss all the happenings that day in court involving the O.J. trial. And Ron and I would banter back and forth about this, and we would discuss it. The yings and the yangs, the ups and downs, the judge-itos, you name it, we talked about it. And that was what I did. Well, ultimately, WOWO started to change. And eventually, well, the folks at WOWO with the big powers, well, they'd left. Bob Severs ultimately retired and passed away in 1999. Chris Roberts left and went over to Ohio and actually bought a radio station over there and doing pretty well. He's still around. Saw him at the WOWO 100-year dinner they had, or luncheon. He was there. And Ron, well, Ron was pretty well cloistered, believe it or not. Apparently he had a stroke. Didn't know much about that, but Ron lived in a place called Canterbury Green Apartments, which is on the north side of Fort Wayne. And he lived there most of his adult life, to the best of my knowledge. Lived along the river in the St. Joe, I believe. And that's where Ron resided. It was his life, that's where he stayed. So Ron became somewhat of a hermit. And that's not a good term to use, but he was cloistered in because obviously he had the health situations. Couldn't get out. But Ron still maintained his personality, still maintained his sense of humor, still maintained who he was. And he's passed away, folks. So one of the great voices of all time, Ron Gregory, talking to Bodie the janitor. But you'll never forget the dulcet pear-shaped tones of one of the greatest voices I personally have ever heard. I could never emulate him because it wasn't my plan. But when you heard Ron, you knew his voice. When you heard Bob Severs, you knew his voice. Same for Chris Roberts. But the guy with the humor, the guy with the smile, the grin, and the wink was none other than the late, great Ron Gregory.